Marilyn Monroe walked out of Darryl Zanuck's office at 2 in the afternoon, her makeup smudged, her hands shaking, and something broken in her eyes that hadn't been there an hour before. The secretary who'd been instructed to hold all calls pretended not to notice, staring intently at her typewriter as the 25-year-old actress tried to compose herself before walking through the hallway where other contract players and visitors might see her. What happened in that office was never officially documented, never investigated, never acknowledged by the studio that employed both of them. But within weeks, Marilyn Monroe did something that no actress in Hollywood's golden age had successfully done before. She refused to continue working under the standard studio contract system that gave men like Darryl Zanuck complete control over her career, her image, and apparently her body. The decision to fight back would cost her everything she'd worked for since arriving in Hollywood at 19. The studio suspended her without pay, leaked stories to gossip columnists about her being difficult and ungrateful, threatened to destroy her career if she didn't apologize and return to work under their terms. And for 2 years, Marilyn Monroe was essentially blacklisted, unable to work in the industry that had made her famous, watching her savings disappear while studio executives waited for poverty and desperation to force her back into submission. The comfortable narrative about Marilyn Monroe has always focused on her beauty, her sexuality, her troubled personal life, and tragic death. But the story of what happened in Darryl Zanuck's office in 1951 and Marilyn's decision to refuse the system that had created and sustained the casting couch as standard Hollywood practice reveals something that history has worked hard to erase. She was the first major actress to say no to sexual exploitation and fight the studio system's retaliation, creating a blueprint for resistance that wouldn't be widely followed for another 60 years. The question that haunted her throughout her career and remains unanswered decades after her death is whether her rebellion was feminist courage or desperate survival instinct, whether she was fighting for principle or simply protecting herself from a system that was destroying her. The answer, as with so much about Marilyn Monroe's actual life beneath the manufactured image, is probably both, and that complexity is precisely what made her so dangerous to the men who profited from keeping actresses powerless and silent. Before we explore this hidden chapter of Hollywood's darkest system and the woman who dared to challenge it, if you're interested in the untold stories of power and resistance in entertainment history, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. The casting couch wasn't a scandal in 1950s Hollywood, it was infrastructure, as fundamental to the studio system as contracts and cameras. Every actress who wanted work understood the unspoken rule: studio executives, producers, and directors had the power to make or break careers, and they expected sexual access as payment for that power. There were no HR departments to complain to, no legal recourse that didn't end with the actress being blacklisted, no public sympathy for women who were seen as using their bodies to get ahead anyway. The system functioned through cultivated ambiguity, where powerful men could claim any sexual encounter had been consensual, while women had no platform to contradict that narrative without ending their careers. Studio contracts formalized this power imbalance, giving executives control over every aspect of an actress's professional and often personal life. Fox could decide which films Marilyn appeared in, what her image would be, who she could date publicly, where she could be photographed, what interviews she could give. The contracts lasted 7 years, with options that the studio could exercise or drop at will, meaning actresses had no guarantee of continued employment, even while being forbidden from working for anyone else. This contractual servitude created perfect conditions for coercion. Women who refused sexual demands could be punished through assignment to terrible roles, suspension without pay, or simply not having their contracts renewed, effectively ending their careers without the studio having to admit why. Darryl Zanuck, who'd run 20th Century Fox since 1935, was legendary for his use of this system. His office on the Fox lot was where young actresses were summoned for meetings that everyone knew weren't really about discussing their next roles. Zanuck made no secret of his belief that he had rights to the women his studio employed. He'd built Fox into one of the most profitable studios through business acumen combined with absolute control, and he viewed the sexual availability of actresses as both a perk of his position and a tool for maintaining power. He wasn't unique in this regard. Every major studio operated similarly, but Zanuck was particularly brazen and particularly vindictive toward women who refused him. The gossip among contract players at Fox was explicit. Avoid being alone with Zanuck if possible, but if summoned to his office, understand that refusal would have consequences. Some women accepted this as the price of success in Hollywood, compartmentalizing the abuse. Some left the industry rather than continue, and a very small number tried to resist while staying, navigating an impossible situation where saying no meant losing everything, while saying yes meant surrendering autonomy over their own bodies. Marilyn Monroe had been trying to navigate this impossible situation since signing with Fox in 1946, and by 1951 she'd decided that continued navigation was no longer sustainable. The specific details of what happened in Zanuck's office in summer 1951 were never documented, but the aftermath was clear and devastating. Within a week of whatever occurred during that meeting, Marilyn informed Fox that she would no longer accept certain assignments, would no longer attend certain meetings, would no longer operate under the assumption that her contract gave the studio rights to her body as well as her talent. The studio's response was immediate and calculated. They assigned her to a terrible role in a forgettable film designed to humiliate and punish. When she refused the assignment, they suspended her contract for insubordination, cutting off her salary while keeping her legally bound to Fox and unable to work for any other studio. This was standard retaliation protocol, refined over decades of studio control. The suspension would continue until Marilyn apologized, accepted whatever terms Fox dictated, and returned to being compliant. Most actresses broke within weeks, unable to survive without income and facing complete career destruction if they held out. But Marilyn, whether through courage or desperation or some combination of both, didn't break. She borrowed money from friends, took odd jobs, lived on savings that disappeared rapidly, and she refused to apologize or return to Fox under the old terms. The studio escalated its campaign to force her submission. Gossip columnists, who relied on Fox for access to stars, began running items about Marilyn being difficult to work with, ungrateful for opportunities she'd been given, mentally unstable. These weren't random observations, they were carefully coordinated character assassination designed to make her unemployable even if she managed to escape her Fox contract. The message to other studios and independent producers was clear: hire Marilyn Monroe and face Fox's displeasure, lose access to Fox's roster of stars for your projects, be cut out of the industry's power network. This unofficial blacklist was devastatingly effective. Even producers who admired Marilyn's talent and wanted to work with her couldn't risk alienating a major studio. Hollywood operated on relationships and access, and Fox had the power to destroy both. For 2 years, from 1951 to 1953, Marilyn Monroe experienced what happened to actresses who refused to accept that sexual availability was part of their contracts. She couldn't work, couldn't appear in public without rumors spreading about why Fox had benched her, couldn't defend herself without violating non-disparagement clauses. She watched her brief moment of career momentum disappear, watched younger actresses get roles she should have had, watched the industry close ranks against her. And she learned that the studio system was designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of resistance she was attempting, that the power imbalance was so complete that individual refusal was essentially suicide. The psychological toll of the suspension period was severe and lasting. Marilyn had grown up with abandonment and instability, had married at 16 partially to escape the foster care system, had learned early that survival meant accepting whatever circumstances offered. The suspension triggered all those childhood fears, the terror of being cast out, of having nothing, of being powerless against forces that controlled her fate. She increased her use of sleeping pills during this period, beginning the dependence that would eventually kill her. She experienced depression and anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms, weight loss and insomnia, and digestive problems that her doctor attributed to stress. And she faced the constant question that would haunt her for the rest of her career: had she made the right choice? Would it have been smarter to just accept Zanuck's demands, to compartmentalize the abuse as other actresses did, to preserve her career by surrendering her autonomy? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were immediate survival calculations, asked while her bank account emptied and her future in Hollywood became increasingly uncertain. The fact that she held out for 2 years suggests extraordinary determination or extraordinary stubbornness or both. But it also reveals how alone she was in this resistance. Other actresses couldn't publicly support her without risking their own careers. Directors and producers who might have sympathized couldn't work with her without facing studio retaliation. Even her agents and managers advised her to apologize and return to Fox, to accept that fighting the studio system was impossible for an individual actress. What finally broke the stalemate wasn't Marilyn's surrender, but a change in calculation by Fox executives. By 1953, her absence from films had actually increased public interest in her. The gossip about her suspension, even though Fox controlled the narrative, had made her notorious in ways that increased her market value. Audiences were curious about the difficult blonde who'd defied the studio, even if they didn't know the real reasons for that defiance. And Fox, recognizing that they could profit from her notoriety if they could control her again, offered a new contract with slightly better terms. Not good terms, not terms that acknowledged any wrongdoing on the studio's part, but marginally improved conditions that allowed both sides to pretend the suspension had been a misunderstanding rather than retaliation for refusing sexual coercion. Marilyn signed the new contract because the alternative was complete career destruction, because 2 years without work had depleted her resources, and because she'd learned that individual resistance against the studio system was ultimately futile without institutional change. But she also signed with a clear understanding that she'd lost, that the system had broken her resistance through economic warfare, and that returning to Fox meant accepting continued exploitation with only superficial modifications to how that exploitation operated. What Marilyn didn't fully understand during her suspension was that her resistance, even though it ultimately failed to change the system, had created ripples throughout Hollywood's community of actresses. Her willingness to risk career destruction rather than submit had been noticed, discussed in whispered conversations between women who couldn't publicly acknowledge what they all knew was happening. An informal network had always existed among actresses, warnings passed between those who'd survived about which executives to avoid, which private meetings were genuine career discussions, and which were traps. But Marilyn's suspension made that network more explicit, more organized, more aware that collective knowledge might eventually translate into collective power. Women started documenting more carefully, keeping records of meetings and incidents, building unofficial archives of evidence that might someday be useful if enough voices spoke together. They developed strategies for deflection and avoidance, ways to protect themselves and each other without openly challenging the system, and they watched Marilyn's career after her return to Fox in 1953, analyzing what happened to an actress who dared to resist, learning from both her courage and her defeat. This whisper network was the infrastructure that would eventually, decades later, make movements like MeToo possible. But in the 1950s it remained underground, powerful men completely unaware that women were building systems of knowledge and solidarity that would ultimately challenge structures that seemed permanent and unassailable. The cost of Marilyn's rebellion continued long after she signed the new Fox contract. She'd been marked as difficult, as someone who didn't understand how Hollywood worked, as a woman who'd tried to use her looks to get ahead and then complained when men expected payment. This reputation followed her throughout the rest of her career, influencing how directors treated her on set, how studios negotiated with her, how the press characterized her. Every subsequent problem she had, every late arrival or forgotten line or difficulty completing a film, was interpreted through the lens of her being the actress who'd fought her studio and lost. The narrative became self-reinforcing. Marilyn was unstable because she'd challenged the system, and her instability proved that women who challenged the system were too fragile to handle the consequences. This circular logic protected the studio system from scrutiny while simultaneously discrediting the women who tried to expose it. And Marilyn, watching this narrative solidify around her, recognized that she'd become a cautionary tale, an example of what happened to actresses who refused to accept that their contracts included sexual obligations as well as professional ones. The remarkable aspect of Marilyn Monroe's rebellion against the casting couch system is not that it failed to immediately change Hollywood, which was inevitable given the complete power imbalance, but that it happened at all. In an industry where every incentive pushed toward silence and submission, where resistance meant career destruction and compliance meant survival, choosing resistance required either extraordinary courage or the kind of desperation that makes impossible choices seem like the only options. Marilyn's decision to refuse Zanuck and fight the suspension, even knowing she would probably lose, established a precedent that barely anyone noticed at the time, but which would become increasingly significant as other women made similar choices in subsequent decades. Each actress who refused, who documented, who whispered warnings to colleagues, contributed to an accumulating body of resistance that would eventually reach critical mass. But that eventual change, that distant MeToo reckoning, came far too late for Marilyn Monroe and the generation of women who survived the studio system by accepting abuse as the price of working in their chosen profession. The studio system itself would collapse by the 1960s, but not because of moral awakening about how it treated women. It collapsed because television and independent production and antitrust rulings made the economic model unsustainable. The casting couch survived the end of the studio system because it wasn't dependent on that specific structure. It was dependent on power imbalance, and power imbalance adapted to new industry configurations without fundamental change. Marilyn Monroe spent the remaining 9 years of her life after the 1951-1953 suspension navigating an industry that had punished her for resistance but couldn't quite destroy her because of her commercial value. She made some of her most iconic films during this period, performances that demonstrated the talent that should have protected her from exploitation but which had proven worthless against systematic abuse. She formed her own production company in 1955, another act of rebellion against studio control that achieved some success but couldn't fundamentally alter the power dynamics that governed Hollywood. And she struggled with depression, anxiety, and addiction that stemmed partially from the psychological toll of surviving in a system designed to break women who refused to be broken. Whether her death in 1962 was suicide, accident, or something more sinister remains debated. But what's undeniable is that she spent her entire adult life fighting battles that she knew she probably couldn't win, against systems that had centuries of practice in maintaining themselves, with weapons that were inadequate against the opposition she faced. The feminist reading of Marilyn Monroe's life asks whether her resistance to the casting couch system represents courageous defiance or desperate survival instinct. The answer is that it was both, and that the question itself reveals how we've misunderstood both feminism and survival. Because in systems designed to give women impossible choices, survival and courage aren't opposites. Survival requires courage, and courage in impossible situations manifests as survival. Marilyn Monroe's decision to walk out of Darryl Zanuck's office in 1951 and refuse to return under the old terms was simultaneously feminist resistance and pragmatic self-preservation, simultaneously doomed to fail and necessary for her sense of self. That complexity, that refusal to be categorized as either victim or hero, is what makes her story so important and so threatening to simplified narratives about how power works and how resistance functions.